5 obvious signs an avoidant is keeping multiple partners on rotation sounds harsh at first, almost too harsh, because most people don't enter these connections believing they are part of some emotional waiting room. They think they're building something rare, something deep, something misunderstood by everyone except the two people inside it. And that's exactly why this kind of situation becomes so dangerous emotionally, because it rarely feels fake in the beginning. In fact, it often feels more intense than normal love ever does. The late-night vulnerability feels real, the eye contact feels real, the trauma stories feel real, the chemistry feels real, and yet somehow, despite all that emotional closeness, there's this constant invisible distance that never fully disappears. A strange feeling that no matter how close you get, you still cannot reach the center of them. You start noticing little fractures in the story, delayed replies that make no sense, energy shifts that happen overnight, moments where they seem completely consumed by you, only to vanish emotionally the second things begin feeling stable. And if you've ever sat there staring at your phone wondering how someone can talk about soul-level connection one day and act emotionally unavailable the next, this video is probably going to hit harder than you expect, because today we're breaking down the 5 obvious signs an avoidant is quietly keeping multiple partners on rotation, not always because they're evil masterminds, not always because they're intentionally manipulative, but because for some avoidants, emotional rotation becomes the safest way to avoid true vulnerability. And while you're watching, subscribe if you've ever become a full-time detective just to understand one emotionally confusing person, because honestly, at this point, some of you deserve honorary investigation badges for the amount of emotional research you've done at 2 a.m. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidance is the belief that they are simply bad at relationships in a passive way, like they accidentally create distance without realizing the impact. But some avoidants don't just avoid intimacy randomly, they manage intimacy strategically. They spread their emotional investment across multiple people because it prevents them from depending too heavily on one connection, and that's the key to understanding this entire dynamic. Dependence feels terrifying to them. Needing one person deeply can feel emotionally dangerous, suffocating, even humiliating, so instead of fully attaching, they create emotional backup systems. One person gives them validation, another gives excitement, another provides comfort. Another becomes the safe emotional home they disappear to when everything else feels overwhelming. The avoidant may genuinely care about all of them in different ways, which is why this gets so psychologically messy. This is not always about ego or conquest in the traditional sense. Sometimes it's about control over vulnerability, because as long as multiple emotional doors remain open, they never have to fully surrender themselves to one relationship. They can always retreat, always redirect their attention, always escape emotional pressure before intimacy becomes too real. And the terrifying part is that many people trapped in this dynamic don't even realize there are others emotionally involved, because avoidants are often experts at creating isolated emotional bubbles where every person feels uniquely special while still never receiving full consistency. The first obvious sign is inconsistent intensity, and this one emotionally destroys people because it creates constant psychological whiplash. One week they are everywhere, double texting, calling you late at night, talking about future plans, saying things that sound deeply committed, watching your stories instantly, acting protective, emotionally open, almost attached in a way that makes you finally relax into the connection. Then suddenly it changes. Their energy drops without warning, responses become colder, conversations lose depth, affection feels mechanical. You start feeling like you imagine the entire emotional closeness from before, and when you ask what happened, they usually give vague answers that never fully explain the shift. I'm stressed, I've just been in my head lately, I need space, nothing's wrong. But deep down, your nervous system senses something bigger, because the shift feels too dramatic to be random. What many people fail to realize is that avoidants keeping multiple emotional connections often cycle attention between people depending on emotional comfort, novelty, pressure, or validation needs. When one relationship begins demanding vulnerability or accountability, they subconsciously redirect energy elsewhere where things still feel lighter, easier, or more emotionally controlled. So the inconsistency isn't always accidental chaos. Sometimes it reflects emotional rotation happening behind the scenes, and the worst part is that the intense moments feel so genuine that people become addicted to waiting for them to return. That's why this dynamic becomes emotionally consuming in a way that healthy relationships rarely do. Your brain starts chasing emotional certainty the same way gamblers chase wins after losses. You replay old conversations, reread messages, analyze tone shifts, obsess over response times. Because intermittent affection creates stronger attachment than stable affection in many cases, the unpredictability itself becomes addictive. When the avoidant suddenly returns after distance, the emotional relief feels euphoric, and your mind interprets that relief as proof of deep love instead of recognizing it as the ending of temporary emotional deprivation. This is why so many people trapped with avoidance say things like, "Nobody has ever made me feel this intensely before." Of course not. Stable love usually doesn't activate survival anxiety every 3 business days, but when someone keeps you emotionally uncertain while occasionally flooding you with intimacy, your nervous system can mistake instability for passion. And meanwhile, the avoidant may genuinely believe they care deeply about you while still quietly distributing emotional energy elsewhere whenever closeness becomes overwhelming. That contradiction is what confuses people the most, because they are not always dealing with someone who feels nothing. They are dealing with someone who feels too much while lacking the emotional security to stay consistent inside one bond. The second obvious sign is compartmentalization so extreme that your relationship starts feeling strangely disconnected from reality. You notice that different parts of their life never seem to overlap naturally. Their friends barely know about you. Their schedule stays weirdly unclear. Plans often remain tentative until the last minute. Social media feels carefully controlled, almost surgically curated to reveal enough emotional closeness to keep you attached, but never enough clarity to define your actual role. You may spend hours talking deeply about childhood wounds, fears, trauma, dreams, insecurities, and emotional pain, yet somehow still have no concrete understanding of where you stand in their real life. And that contradiction slowly starts eating at you because emotional intimacy without structural intimacy creates confusion. You know their deepest fears but still haven't met important people around them. You know their attachment wounds but still cannot get a direct answer about exclusivity. You feel emotionally chosen in private while remaining publicly undefined. And for avoidance maintaining multiple emotional options, compartmentalization becomes essential because overlap creates accountability. Once worlds collide, inconsistencies become harder to manage. Different versions of themselves become harder to maintain. Emotional rotation depends on separation. Every connection exists in its own controlled environment where difficult questions can be delayed and emotional ambiguity can survive longer. And people tolerate this for far too long because the emotional connection feels unusually deep. But emotional depth alone is not commitment. Vulnerability alone is not loyalty. Someone can tell you their darkest secrets and still keep you emotionally compartmentalized in ways that prevent true intimacy from ever fully forming. And eventually, after enough emotional ambiguity, people stop asking themselves whether they feel loved and start asking whether they are even allowed to need clarity at all. That's the psychological trap compartmentalization creates. You slowly become grateful for fragments. A sudden vulnerable conversation feels like commitment. A late-night emotional confession feels like progress. A tiny moment of reassurance feels massive because the overall relationship lacks stability. And the longer this continues, the more you begin shrinking your own expectations just to preserve access to the connection. That's why the third obvious sign hits so hard once you finally recognize it. They disappear during emotionally significant moments. Not randomly, not accidentally. Specifically when emotional presence matters most. Birthdays suddenly become complicated. Relationship-defining conversations trigger distance. Important holidays create withdrawal. Conflict leads to silence. Moments where reassurance would deepen intimacy somehow become the exact moments they emotionally vanish. And at first, people usually interpret this as emotional immaturity or stress. They think maybe the avoidant just struggles with pressure. But when someone is quietly balancing multiple emotional attachments, emotionally significant moments become psychologically overwhelming because those moments demand prioritization, accountability, and consistency. They force the relationship to become real in ways that can no longer stay vague. And for avoidants who survive through emotional escape routes, that level of relational definition can feel terrifying. So what happens instead? They retreat, sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally, sometimes digitally. The energy changes right when the relationship approaches a deeper threshold. You finally ask where this is going, and suddenly they need time to think. You express emotional needs and they become exhausted. You try to establish security and they start acting trapped. It creates this devastating emotional contradiction where the moments that should bring two people closer somehow create more distance instead. And the person on the receiving end almost always internalizes it. They think maybe they asked for too much, maybe they became too emotional, maybe they pressured the connection too hard. But healthy relationships do not punish emotional honesty with disappearance. That's important to understand. Because avoidants keeping multiple partners emotionally nearby often experience intimacy itself as pressure once expectations rise. When multiple people are attached to them emotionally, every serious conversation becomes another emotional responsibility to manage. Every commitment becomes another wall closing in around their sense of freedom. So instead of facing the discomfort directly, they escape temporarily to wherever things feel easier, lighter, or less emotionally demanding. And the terrifying thing is that when they come back afterward, they often return affectionate enough to reset the entire cycle. Suddenly they miss you, suddenly they are vulnerable again, suddenly they act emotionally invested enough to make you doubt your concerns. And this emotional reset keeps people trapped for months or even years because the connection never fully dies, it just keeps collapsing and reviving over and over again. The fourth obvious sign is that every relationship conversation somehow stays undefined, no matter how emotionally intense things become. This is where people begin losing trust in their own instincts because the avoidant often sounds emotionally intelligent while still avoiding actual clarity. They'll say things like, "I don't want labels to ruin what we have," or "I just want things to happen naturally," or "I've been hurt before and I'm trying to move carefully." And listen, sometimes those statements are genuine. Not every emotionally cautious person is secretly juggling multiple partners, but when ambiguity becomes chronic despite deep emotional involvement, something important is happening underneath the surface. Because emotionally healthy people move toward clarity over time, not away from it. Yet with rotational avoidance, the relationship often feels frozen in permanent emotional limbo. Enough intimacy to keep you attached, enough uncertainty to avoid accountability, enough vulnerability to feel meaningful, enough distance to preserve escape routes. And this creates one of the most psychologically exhausting experiences a person can go through because human beings are not designed to live inside constant relational ambiguity. Your nervous system keeps searching for stability while the relationship itself keeps resisting definition. What makes this even more confusing is how beautifully avoidants can intellectualize their resistance to commitment. They don't always sound careless. In fact, they often sound deeply self-aware. They frame their inconsistency as emotional caution, independence, healing, self-protection, or fear of ruining the connection. And because there is usually some truth inside those explanations, people stay. They empathize. They become patient. They convince themselves that if they just create enough emotional safety, the avoidant will eventually choose them fully. But meanwhile, the avoidant continues benefiting from emotional access without offering emotional certainty. That's the hidden imbalance. And when multiple partners are involved emotionally, ambiguity becomes extremely useful because labels create expectations, expectations create obligations, and obligations threaten the avoidant's carefully maintained sense of emotional freedom. So instead of directly choosing, they often remain suspended between connections while giving each person just enough hope to continue investing emotionally. And the longer someone stays in that uncertainty, the more emotionally dependent they become on tiny signs of reassurance. A good morning text suddenly feels like proof. A vulnerable conversation suddenly feels like commitment. But clarity should never have to be decoded like hidden messages in a psychological thriller. Then comes the fifth obvious sign, and once people notice this one, the entire relationship often starts unraveling in their mind. You begin realizing the avoidant recycles emotional scripts, the same compliments, the same future fantasies, the same stories about why they struggle with intimacy, the same disappearing excuses, the same emotionally charged phrases that once felt deeply personal to you suddenly begin sounding strangely rehearsed. Maybe you notice patterns in how they mirror people emotionally. Maybe you realize their vulnerability appears almost too perfectly timed whenever distance grows. Maybe you start recognizing that the intimacy often follows formulas instead of genuine progression. And that realization hurts on a level most people are not prepared for, because nothing breaks the illusion faster than discovering you may not have been uniquely understood in the way you believed. Rotational attachment often creates emotional automation. The avoidant learns which emotional behaviors maintain connection, soothe conflict, reignite attachment, or prevent abandonment, and over time those behaviors can become repeated across multiple people. That doesn't necessarily mean every emotion was fake. That's the painful nuance here. Some avoidants genuinely feel deep affection while still engaging in emotionally fragmented behavior. They may sincerely miss multiple people, sincerely care about multiple people, sincerely feel connected in the moment. But sincerity alone does not create healthy intimacy. Consistency does, accountability does, emotional clarity does, and when someone repeatedly mirrors personalities, adapts themselves to whoever they're speaking to, or deploys vulnerability mainly when emotional access is threatened, the relationship slowly starts feeling emotionally unstable in a way that's hard to explain until you finally step back and see the entire pattern. Because suddenly all those moments that once felt spontaneous begin fitting together differently. The perfectly timed affection after distance, the emotionally poetic messages after conflict, the future promises that never solidify into action, the intimacy that always intensifies right before you're about to emotionally detach. And for many people, this becomes the most devastating stage of all, not because they realize the avoidant never cared, but because they realize care was never enough to stop the cycle. And that realization creates a kind of grief that's difficult to explain to people who have never experienced it, because you are not just mourning the person, you are mourning the version of the relationship you believed was slowly becoming real. You start replaying moments that once felt sacred and wondering how many of them were partially scripted survival behaviors designed to maintain attachment without requiring full emotional surrender. The compliments that once made your chest tighten now sound strangely universal. The emotional confessions that once felt uniquely intimate begin resembling carefully deployed vulnerability. And one of the hardest parts is recognizing how much of yourself you gave in response to those moments. Because when someone appears emotionally wounded yet emotionally magnetic at the same time, empathetic people naturally move closer. They want to understand, they want to help, they want to become the safe place the avoidant has supposedly never had before. That's why avoidants often attract deeply empathetic individuals without even trying. Emotionally aware people interpret inconsistency as pain rather than incompatibility. They see emotional withdrawal and think, this person is scared, instead of asking, why am I constantly being emotionally destabilized? And that difference changes everything. Empathetic people are especially vulnerable to rotational dynamics because they are naturally trained to search for hidden meaning underneath behavior. They don't just react to actions, they investigate wounds. So when the avoidant disappears, they assume there must be a deeper fear underneath it. When the avoidant resists commitment, they assume there must be unresolved trauma causing it. When the avoidant gives mixed signals, they focus on the moments of emotional depth rather than the overall pattern of inconsistency. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin building emotional loyalty around potential instead of reality. They become emotionally attached to who the avoidant could become if enough safety, patience, understanding, and love were finally provided. But this creates a dangerous imbalance where one person is constantly trying to heal the relationship while the other person remains emotionally fragmented inside it. And if multiple partners are involved emotionally, this dynamic becomes even more painful because each person often believes they are uniquely helping the avoidant open up. Each person believes they are slowly becoming the one who finally reaches the avoidant at a deeper level. Meanwhile, the avoidant may be recreating versions of emotional closeness across several connections simultaneously, not always maliciously, but because fragmented attachment feels safer than total vulnerability. That's when the fantasy trap fully begins. The relationship quietly transforms into an emotional competition nobody openly acknowledges. You start believing that if you love them correctly enough, calmly enough, patiently enough, they will finally stop running and choose you fully. And this fantasy becomes emotionally addictive because the avoidant occasionally reinforces it with moments of extraordinary closeness. They may suddenly become intensely affectionate after distance. They may open up emotionally in ways that feel deeply raw and sincere. They may even imply a future together during vulnerable moments. And every time that happens, your brain interprets it as progress. Proof that the walls are finally coming down. Proof that the connection is becoming exclusive emotionally, even if it still lacks actual clarity. But what many people don't realize is that avoidants often confuse emotional intensity with emotional readiness. They can genuinely feel overwhelmed with emotion in one moment and still retreat from commitment the next. So the partner stays emotionally invested, believing the relationship is evolving, while the avoidant continues oscillating between closeness and escape. And if other emotional connections exist in the background, the instability becomes even harder to detect because attention shifts create the illusion of emotional inconsistency rather than emotional distribution. This is also why people trapped in these dynamics become obsessed with tiny emotional victories. A deeper conversation suddenly feels like a breakthrough. Being posted publicly feels like progress. Spending more time together feels like evidence of emotional exclusivity. But healthy relationships usually do not require constant interpretation. They do not leave people chronically scanning for hidden signs of emotional security. The fantasy trap survives through ambiguity because ambiguity allows hope to expand endlessly. You fill in missing certainty with imagination. You interpret silence optimistically. You excuse behavior that would normally feel unacceptable because emotionally intense moments keep resetting your belief that something profound is happening underneath the confusion. And to be fair, sometimes something profound is happening emotionally. That's the hardest truth of all. Many avoidants are not emotionless. Many are not cold manipulators laughing behind closed doors. Some are deeply conflicted people who crave intimacy while simultaneously fearing the emotional exposure intimacy requires, and that internal conflict creates devastating collateral damage when they try to maintain closeness without fully committing to it. Because from the avoidance perspective, rotational attachment often feels less like manipulation and more like emotional survival. One connection may feel emotionally grounding, another may feel exciting and validating, another may feel emotionally safe because expectations remain low. They compartmentalize